morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second edition of the Anant Curatorial Forum. To see such a distinguished gathering of curators, academics, scholars, artists, and cultural practitioners in one space is a testament to the growing urgency and relevance of curatorial discourse today. When we founded this initiative, it was with the intent of addressing critical gaps in the contemporary arts landscape in South Asia. Last year's inaugural edition laid the foundation for key questions around the curatorial role, and the depth of engagement from our panelists and audience exceeded all expectations. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the many curators who contributed to making that first edition a success. Their insights, provocations, and questions have helped shape the conversations we will continue today. Anant Foundation for the Arts, a non-profit organization, was established with the vision of supporting modern and contemporary South Asian arts through meaningful exchanges, trans-regional dialogues, and institutional partnerships. Since our inception last year, we have taken deliberate steps toward this vision, whether through the J.K. Paper Award for the Arts, Propositions in Paper, which champions innovation in paper-based practices, or through this forum, which offers a space for in-depth discussions on curation as a dynamic interdisciplinary practice. As we reconvene this year, we seek to build on that momentum by examining the curatorial function in relation to the pressing political, social, and aesthetic questions of our time. The curator's role has evolved, no longer limited to selecting and displaying objects, but extending to constructing narratives, interrogating histories, and fostering spaces for critical engagement. Curatorial practice is never neutral. It can be an act of authorship, negotiation, or even resistance. More than a static category, it's a dynamic process that interacts with and shapes society and culture. Many of you, artists, writers, researchers, and cultural practitioners, have dedicated your lives to the belief that art matters, that it can shift perspectives, open minds, and deepen our connection to our histories and futures. This makes it all the more imperative to foster dialogue, promote knowledge sharing, and expand how art is understood. Over the next 2 days, we will engage in 6 thoughtfully curated panels that probe these urgent questions, shaped by the insight and vision of Mira Menezes, who leads the Anant Foundation for the Arts, and whose curatorial leadership has been integral to this forum. We hope this platform continues to be a space for dialogue, reflection, and collaboration. I extend my deepest gratitude to Mira, Sohar Pem, and the entire team for their dedication and hard work in bringing this edition of the forum to life. Their efforts have made this gathering possible. A special welcome to our speakers, many of whom have traveled from across India and the region. And to the audience, thank you for being here. We hope the conversations sparked in this forum will extend beyond these sessions, leading to new collaborations and fresh perspectives on curatorial practice. With that, I would like to invite Mira to give her welcome remarks. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you, Mamta, for your generosity and support in hosting the second edition of the Anant Curatorial Forum. It's really a pleasure to be able to organize this symposium after the very successful first edition last year. Thank you to all our speakers who've accepted our invitation to participate, and all of you in the room who've taken the time and trouble to attend. I'm happy to see both familiar and unfamiliar faces in the room. I'm going to keep my opening remarks short in the interest of time. We conceived of this symposium to start a discussion around curatorial practice, which we felt had not received the attention it deserved here. We wanted to look at the curatorial function as a framework of inquiry, not just within the arts, but across other disciplines. Besides connecting art, artists, and communities, how could we perhaps use it to address the challenges that we face today? As the world order that we took for granted crumbles around us, as our democratic values and liberal norms come under assault, and protest and dissent is squashed, what does curatorial responsibility look like? As regimes become more authoritarian and censorship and self-censorship is rife, how can we curators work around these strictures? In a world where climate change naysayers abound and fake news is peddled as truth, what stand can we take as curators? More importantly, how can we continue a politics of care, as the word curator implies? I hope that the forum again provides a safe space for 2 days of discussion, debate, and dissent. I also hope it offers us a space of imagination and opens up new ways of thinking, interrogating, and being with the world. Finally, some of the themes that emerged out of our last curatorial forum have served to inform this edition, so I hope the next 2 days of deliberation will in turn feed into our next edition of the Anant Curatorial Forum. Now, some housekeeping rules. Please put your mobile phones on silent, and if you do need to leave the room for some reason, try and do it between presentations and not during one. I also request all the presenters to stick to the time allocated to them, as we're running on a very tight schedule. I hope you enjoy the next 2 days. And with that, let me just move on to the program for today. Our first panel is Archive Between Memory and History. It will run from 10:15 to 11:45. We'll have a tea break from 11:45 to 12:15. Our second panel is on Politics and Art, Curating Difficult Knowledges from 12:15 to 1:45. We've got an ample lunch break from 1:45 to 3. Please use the time to meet the curators, discuss, have discussions among yourselves. I think, these discussions that take place on the sidelines of a symposium are as enriching and important as the presentations you're going to hear later today. And finally, we have panel 3, Intersectional Politics, Theorizing Multiplicity, which runs from 3 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. With that, let me invite our speakers and panelists for the first session, Archive Between Memory and History, our moderator, Suvani Suri. Suvani. We have Duygu Demir, NayanTara Gurung Kakshapati, and Puja Vaish. I will just start with reading the bios. This might take some time, so please bear with me, and then I will hand it over to Suvani. So Suvani Suri is a practitioner based in New Delhi, India. Her artistic research and curatorial inquiries plumb the gaps, cracks, and leaks found within the technological processes of production, mediation, and perception of sound. Actively engaged in thinking through the regional and speculative capacities of listening, voicing, oral histories, acoustic ecologies, and archival soundscapes, her questions often take the form of curatorial propositions, workshops, publications, podcasts, auditory texts, objects and installations, live and discursive interventions. Suvani's works have been exhibited at the Dystopie Sound Art Biennale, at the Singapore Art Museum, Serendipity Arts Festival, Kunsthalle Bern, Khoj Studios, and the Kochi Muziris Biennale, among others. As part of a collective investigation, she co-conceived the telephonic project Out of Line, which received the FICA Public Art Grant. She was one of the curators of the Kochi Students Biennale and is in the curatorial team for the upcoming Listening Biennale. As the Associate Curator at Liquid Architecture in Melbourne and Research Fellow of Media Arts at Sarai, CSDS, her research interests span experimental practices across the Asia-Pacific that critically engage with mediatic and sonic sensoriums, flows, and infrastructures. Duygu Demir is an art historian and curator with a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology on articulations of modern painting from the late Ottoman Empire and early Republican Turkey. Before her graduate studies, she worked as a programmer at SALT in Istanbul In addition to SALT in Ankara and Istanbul, she curated exhibition at MIT's Keller Gallery, Arte in Istanbul, and the Tate Modern. In addition to her academic research, she writes articles and reviews in contemporary art for magazines and online platforms in Turkey and abroad. Demir's research topics include exhibition histories, transnational encounters, and moments of confluence between art and architecture, in addition to contemporary art practice, especially of the non-Western kind. Demir recently joined the NYU Abu Dhabi community as the curator of its art gallery and research assistant professor in art history. She has a combined BA in visual arts and art history from Columbia University in New York. NayanTara Gurung Kakshapati lives and works in Kathmandu, Nepal. She is the co-founder and artistic director of Photo Circle, Nepal Picture Library, and Photo KTM, platforms and initiatives that nourish image making, history telling, and dialogic engagements with diverse publics. As a cultural organizer and curator, NayanTara enjoys working collaboratively with photographers, filmmakers, researchers, writers, translators, educators, professionals from various fields to develop multidisciplinary exhibitions, publications, commissions, workshops, and other co-productions. She is committed to creating possibilities for people to think, make, speak, and organize in different ways to come together in imperfect solidarity, to learn, question, disrupt, and resist, but also work towards repair. And finally, Puja Vaish. She's an artist, curator, and educator, currently serving as director of the Jehangir Nicholson Art Foundation at CSMVS Museum in Mumbai. She specializes in modern and contemporary art and has developed several significant exhibitions. Her curatorial work include Nasreen Mohammadi, The Vastness Again and Again, which offered first fresh perspectives on Mohammadi's artistic legacy. Out of Place, Har Jagah Ajnabi, examining notions of place through 33 Indian artists' works, and The Fragility of Time, the first ever presentation contextualizing Nalini Malani's early works. For the museum's centenary, she curated Sahaj Rahal and Sisters, and most recently presented Photo Lies featuring Dayanita Singh's works. Previously serving as a curator at the Dr. Bhaudaji Lal Museum, Vaish worked extensively with colonial era collections, contributed research to the museum's publications, and co-curated Connecting Threads, Textile in Contemporary Practice. Her academic career includes teaching positions at MSU's Baroda Faculty of Fine Arts, Delhi College of Art, and Kamla Raheja Vidyanidhi Institute of Architecture. Vaish holds a master's and bachelor's degree from MSU Baroda, where she received the gold medal and the Nasreen Mohammadi Award. And with that, I finally hand over to Suvani Suri to take this forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Meera, for the introductions and for setting up the morning. And thank you all for being here. Also, my thanks to the Anant Arts Foundation for inviting us all into this dialogue. And Pem, Meera again, and all of the crew who's been working on the sidelines on the back end, initiating, shaping, and organizing the series. And what looks like will be a very generative next set of 2 days. So it's actually quite great to be in such fabulous company and to be sharing space and time with thinkers and practitioners that I very much admire here, Puja, Duygu, and NayanTara. And I'd like to actually go back to the initial prompt that was shared by Meera and Pem as a sort of springboard for our conversations when we were invited into the fray. And in that initial prompt, there was a turn towards the French historian Pierre Nora, who characterizes memory as temporally prior to and conceptually independent of history. So for him, and here I excerpt the synopsis that was sent across to us to mull over and take off from. For Pierre Nora, memory is spontaneous, it is in perpetual evolution, it is prone to manipulation, appropriation, deformations, and it lies somewhere between remembering and forgetting, but is always alive as human praxis. History, on the other hand, he says, survives as a reconstructed object of memory that is past, that is always problematic and incomplete, and dependent on external sites and contemporary monuments to take on the responsibility of remembering. So in the light of this formulation, the archive, which is going to be the subject of our inquiry today and which has been sort of been spoken about, debated, dialogued, contested quite a lot in contemporary times. So the archive can be thought of as being placed within this tension of memory and history as that which has the possibility to oscillate and keep resituating itself between the two. But how and where it gets located is often in terms of the ways in which it is read and by whom. So as we took off from this initial provocation and started the exchanges that we did, one of the things that struck me was that while we often think about, debate, and discuss the ways in which artists interrogate, interpret, subvert, and reconfigure archival material structures and contexts, and that's also where my questions lie, what the practices that I've gathered here today in the panel are doing is a bit of a departure from there. That is to say that even while drawing from and drawing into the artistic, the focus here is going to be how curatorial responses and propositions to archival notions and structures are framed. What are the methods and approaches that it applies, and what are the forms of thinking that it seeks to activate in encountering the archive? And here I'd actually like to hark back to one of the panel discussions at the Curatorial Forum last year. And I think it was a part of a panel titled In Conversation with Institutional Templates, which was premised on an exhibition of how various exhibition-making strategies are shaped and shape contemporary curatorial methodologies. So in this panel, what Samira Bose, who's a curator and a programs coordinator at the Asiad Archive in India, drew our attention to is the charge in an archive and the ways in which the curatorial and exhibitionary can facilitate ruptures, eruptions, and interruptions in the seemingly quiet everyday of the archive. She insists on thinking through the shifting archival materialities and the critical conversations surrounding it that are actually replete with questions of loss, preservation, corruption, and decay. So I feel like this archival charge that has been foregrounded by Samira in the last forum is actually a thread that continues and that has now blown up into an entire panel, which will be interrogating a range of archival dispositions that are sensed and drawn out in contemporary curatorial practice. So what this session is interested in doing is unpacking and expanding upon the notion of the archive through different curatorial assemblies, tactics, and interventions. The insistence here is on reading and rereading the archive, not in order to lead to answers, but to open up and amplify historical and political contingencies and dissonances that can often only be heard through an active engagement in the here and now. So each of the panelists, as we see, will be thinking through the different intensities of engagement with the archive by moving between the exhibitionary, the discursive, and the pedagogical modes of inquiry, and in the process generating new encounters and critical readings of archival lossiness, gaps, and absences. What also gets eked out is the tension and the range of tensions between history and memory, forgetting and remembering, constructed and reproduced, found and rendered, often disassembling the time in and off of an archive and opening it to other possibilities and other possible lives and configurations, including the speculative and including the lives of the archive that will have been. So with that, I think I'd like to invite Puja Vaish to begin with her thoughts and reflections. Over to you.
I think I have to go there to present. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mamta, and thank you, Meera, for inviting me to this forum. I work at the Jahangir Nicholson Art Foundation in Mumbai. So the JNF, just to give you a little background, it houses a very significant collection of post-independence Indian art, and it serves also as an organization. We also serve as the modern and contemporary art wing of the CSMVS Museum. People may remember it or know it as the erstwhile Prince of Wales Museum, which was later renamed in the 90s as the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya. I guess that's also another pointer in thinking about archives and history, the naming and renaming of things in the context of post-colonial narratives. As a curator working with varied archives of the ancient, modern, and contemporary, I think the challenge is in how, working in the museum, we're constantly looking at varied archives which range from the ancient, the modern, and the contemporary. And I think that one of the challenges as a curator is really how do we revisit these histories, how do we frame them or reframe them to present them to the public. So in this context, I think what an archive is can really vary. And what is it that we constitute as an archive? I think archives are always, one of the things about archives is that they're always created, they don't just exist. And therefore, archives always carry the perspectives of the creator and the time in which that they are created. So every time you look into archives, which could be anything, it could be a collection of objects, documents, images, artworks, architectures, you may discover something completely different and new. So in this sense, I think archives can both reveal as well as conceal. I think they can simultaneously tell several stories. They can also tell completely diametrically opposite stories. And I think so what really becomes important is how they are structured. It is about representation and the narratives that we draw from the archive. So I think historians, archaeologists, and curators also carry their own points of view, which reflect in the collections, archives, or narratives that we build. So at the museum, my curatorial work has involved like microhistories and untold stories as tools of intervention in museum practice and art history. This approach often, as you can imagine, involves working both with and against archives to retell stories of Indian art from alternate perspectives. So I think it means that you have to sort of look elsewhere. You have to look in oral traditions. You have to look in regional texts in other places. Other places which may not be documented in the mainstream. So my presentation today is about looking at the out-of-place archives, anomalies, other archives, non-existent archives, as also creating new archives. So I'll now go into the presentation. I've compiled about 4 of our recent exhibitions to elaborate these ideas around the archive. So this is an exhibition on the artist Nasreen Mohammadi. In the case of this artist, I think there's a lot of mystery that surrounds her life and her work because she rose to prominence much after her death. Even though now she's recognized as one of the most ingenious abstractionists of modern Indian art, I think what has come across or how she's, the impression and how she's been portrayed as has usually been as like the impression or the aura around the artist that has sort of gotten built is one of a reclusive or a lone artist, almost as if her art sort of rose out of a vacuum or a silo. So I think while planning this exhibition, one of the things was part of the research was built by collecting oral stories from people who really were close to her, who knew her family, as well as studying archives, family archives, and many other archives from different sources in places where she was, where she worked, and then sort of reading the artist's practice through connected references and connected artists' initiatives. So I think this really revealed a very different kind of perspective, and I think that's the feedback also that we got for the show. It was one of our most successful shows because people said it broke many myths about what they thought about Nasreen as an artist. And I think it was about locating her in these initiatives, how connected she was, both as an artist and as an art teacher in Baroda. So this was the aspect that I wanted to bring, and the challenge was how to present it. It presented about 61 of her works, some which had not been seen before. Also several archives. So the challenge was how to present the works and the archives and how to speak about these connected histories. So I'll just go into the presentation. So one of the things that I decided to do was also bring in other artists' works for the exhibition. And so here you see, for instance, Nalini Malani's work on the left. And also on the right is things that were found in Nasreen's studio, in her Baroda studio by her family once she had passed away. And so these were the sort of connections, because that work by Nalini was done at the Vision Exchange workshop hosted by set up by Akbar Padamsi, where Nalini recalls that she and Nasreen both worked together in the dark room. That's a photogram, and these are also similar, like, experiments with photography and photograms and other things. So you see these kind of connections. Similarly, like through other friendships of Jairam Patel and then Nasreen on the left. So you could kind of see these sort of ideas. Also several, spoke to several people, got letters, archives, photographs from her friends, from students, from, so it really showed this kind of mutual exchange of ideas through art, through just living and, discussing things. Also to locate her in different other moments. For instance, this was actually from the Al-Qazi Foundation archives. And these were again play sets that happened at the Bulabai Desai Center, where there was the theater unit by Ibrahim Al-Qazi, of course. But the reason I had put these in to really see that moment of abstraction in Bombay. And many of the sets were also designed by the artists. And then over here, there's also an Alexander Calder mobile that was got, and it's hung on the set. But you can see, I think, that kind of abstraction even within the set building, and So again, many other photographs. One of the things that people also, I think, the austerity in her work has sort of been read into her life and her personality as well. And so here you see, that many things about her, that she only wore white, or she was very, austere. But here, I mean, you just see that kind of camaraderie. I could barely find any photos of her wearing only white, actually. And she looks quite like congenial with others, artists, and really involved in many of the art initiatives then. This is the next exhibition that, so I basically about this and about archives was, sometimes it's like really looking, maybe in selecting what you, while you're curating, in selecting, maybe you're also feeding into a mainstream narrative, and what the archive is telling you might be something quite different also. So this is the next exhibition that I want to talk about. It's actually a project that I invited. It was by the Kamla Raheja Vidyanidhi Institute of Architecture. So it was a project by a architecture college, a very fascinating project, because it was called A Forest in the City, living within Sanjay Gandhi National Park and RA Colony in Mumbai. As the name suggests, it was actually looking at this large green expanse, the forest, literally in the bustling city of Bombay. What was very interesting is that this project had several collaborators that they brought in, which was also architects, urban planners, artists, community members, activists, and archivists. So it presented many varied sources of archives, and often competing regimes of representation that are presented together. Like, how do we think of this? One can imagine that the forest in the city is obviously a very contested space. And so by presenting different archives and different sort of data points, it brought together the multiple imaginings of the forest. So these sort of things that were presented in the exhibition, these were representations of the forest, which took the form of objects that ranged from maps, artworks, policy documents, religious totems, cultural objects, and much more. It was basically to think about the forest, which can constantly be reconfigured as to what it can be: a national park, a sanctuary, a home, a property, a park. And so the idea to present this exhibition in the museum was also to look at the idea of archives and how objects in this exhibition could also, how could we think about building archives and how archives connect to culture, how narratives connect to meaning, while also looking at categories of folk, tribal, and contemporary art. So one of the very interesting things that this project did was also that it marked out. So it was divided into two sections. One section was mainly about map making, about really imaging the area. And the other section was called a forest of claims, which was different objects that were put into conversation. So one of the really interesting things that this project brought about was that it marked out, or it recognized, that there are many communities that also live in the forest of Mumbai, which are both tribal and non-tribal communities. And in most of the state imaginings or the plans for the forest, which of course keeps the shape of the forest, and the maps and all keep changing of what is the forest, what is the city, and development plans and things. This sort of brought in also those voices of people who are actually residing. So we never think of the forest as people who are actually living there also. So that was one of the things. So this was, I'm just showing you a few slides. This was a part which is about the map making. So what you see on the ground, the table sort of thing, was a 24-foot drawing by architects which mapped out the area. And parallelly, we also had Dinesh Bharat, who's a Warli artist, is also a Warli artist who lives in the forest. So there are many Warli art communities also, like Warli communities living in the forest. And so this was his impression of the forest. And the painting, I mean, I'm not going to go into many details, but it was also a 24-foot painting that he created while the exhibition was on in the space. And so it was actually two different ways of imaging it. And his work was very, very interesting because it brought in, they've been there for years, like decades and centuries. So he also brought in a colonial, like, there's an old bungalow, there are little particularities and specificities of the place, of the areas, the local stories and things like that. So here you see, the same sort of area represented by the architects and by Dinesh through his drawing. Now again, so these were the many different, like these are the institutional imaginations, which this is the MMRDA plans. Now across the years, they of course keep changing. And the main changes also are owed to the changes in regime of, like, what is a green zone, what is the development areas, what are reserved, many sort of things like that. The other very interesting thing that was in this project was that the GIS mapping, a lot of the ways of mapping can also sort of lop off thousands of, hundreds of kilometers of land in just the mapping. So, what is accurate in the archive, and again, these are very different ways of thinking about the same place. This is what I was telling you. I think this, what this project did was the first map of its kind that they have made. It's a satellite image, but the dots that you see, I'm sorry, it's not very readable or visible, but it was a large map that was placed as a vinyl in the gallery. And here they've actually gone and done the research. So it was a 3-year project done by the Kamla Raheja in collaboration with Pani Haq Samiti. And here they've actually marked out the settlements in the forest, which are never recognized in state maps or anything. So this is another way of imagining. This was a hand-drawn map of a family that's lived there for years and generations, and you can read that it's basically how they've marked out the territory. So this is a hand-drawn map. Yeah, how are we doing on time?
I think we have to wrap up at 5.
Oh, okay, then I'll just go very, very quickly. Okay. Okay, so this I actually included in this presentation because I think one of the things that Meera had given as a prompt was also, historical amnesia and places of worship being targeted. And so this is actually on a very ground level, because this is a Adivasi place of worship where the Vagoba, the leopard deity, has been, in a revamp by Karyakartas, has been appropriated, and it becomes that leopard deity has become Durga's tiger, and it's become like a Hindu temple. So I'll just move on. And this is something that wouldn't even be in any archives, say, before this project. These are very local stories. I'll just move on. This was the Forest of Claims. You see many different objects from political posters, banners, music, things of the community. Maybe I'll skip this one and just go to the last one then. This was another project called Out of Place Har Jagah Ajnabi, which was there. And in this, basically, I was looking at ideas of place through many artists in the JNF collection, how places have been represented in Indian art. So you see like many places like Benares and Kashmir through different artists' work. But there were many sections which I won't go to, but one of the main sections was also migrant labor and those kind of histories of movement and travel, again through many artists' work, so I won't go through that, but just to give you a visual. This was also part of that whole labor and migrant section, which was Nilima Sheikh's work on in 2024, when a lot of 2022, and in the pandemic, when we saw many of the migrant laborers sort of stranded and distraught. So I was talking about this because it was to build a sort of visual archive of place and travel and movement, histories of migration. I'm going to wrap up very soon, Suvani. Yeah. So this was a project that I had curated. There was a museum centenary year, and this was the first exhibition, which was called Ancestors. So I invited the artist Sahej Rahal because I thought his work was very, very perfect to hold these conversations about archives, how we sort of speak about archives and connect data sets to how we speak about culture and civilizations. So very quickly, it was basically his project, the work that he's done here was he had looked at a site in Amgaon in Maharashtra. It's an archaeological site where there was one burial urn which was incongruous with the rest of the burial sites, burials in the place. And of course, as you can imagine, many different archaeologists had different theories about what could be the origins or why this burial was different. So it was taking from speculative archaeology where, an incident or thing of the past can spark so many different sort of viewpoints. And so he created a parallel narrative from that site, which was to imagine a post-human kind of civilization. And in this exhibition, there were drawings, paintings, sculptures, writings, performances, and also an artificial intelligence program. What was very interesting is that his imagination of apocalypse or post-human sort of landscape was not a bleak desert landscape. Rather, it was strewn with really objects and things that represent material and overabundances in archives. So it was interesting because it was kind of a playful project that was really in a playful way to talk about some very important issues that, of civilization, of cultures, of ritual, of myth making, of beliefs. And so many of these were things that these were drawings that he had made. And these are all, again, completely make believe from that side, but completely make believe. So it's a parallel sort of narrative. And so one of the things was that people could make their own stories. So there was no real, things weren't so stringent as what has to be where. So we had a lot of fun putting this together. And it was interesting because, again, you're trying to look for connections. So it was about, building stories and how we speak about civilizations and culture through archives. So here's like a bunch of objects. A lot of these, some I had put together, some he had done. And it was interesting how visitors sort of responded to this. We also had many engagement programs where they would be, making their own stories. So for instance, interestingly, some people were like, oh, that's a mother goddess, and, the ideas of warmth. But these were completely random, actually. There wasn't, everyone would have their own sort of way of thinking about this. Yeah, so I think in piece, it's really about piecing fragments, how we think, and it reflects a lot on one's own beliefs and like how we make narratives. So I think to end, I will just say that I think what's important is that storytelling becomes a very important tool in that sense to build a shared consciousness. And also, I think when history is understood not as what is lived, but what is remembered, in that sense, archives usually come into play. So one of the main things I wanted to just wrap this up and say is that I think archives by themselves don't really tell one clear story. And in that sense, it's really, really about how we kind of think about these things. I just wanted to end with this because I thought it was very apt for the presentation and also the panel, which is Archive Between Memory and History. It's a line very famous by Agha Shahid Ali, of course, which says, your history gets in the way of my memory. In your absence, you polish me into just a few lines that I've taken. Your memory gets in the way of my memory. So just to leave it at that history is really an infinite project, and it's really, I think, about perspective. And in that sense, to think about archives. This is also a line that has been quoted quite a lot by in one of Nilima Sheikh's work, where she's sort of speaking about Kashmir as this place of strife, and it's also how things are documented as opposed to sort of lived experience. So I'm just going to end there. Thank you.
Thanks, Puja. Yeah, okay, cool. So we've got the alarm bells going.
I'll start talking while this happens. Hello, everybody. Nice to be here. Thank you for this invitation. It's lovely to be in great company here on the panel. I see some familiar faces, but many new friends here. So I'm going to spend just a few moments to get us going to tell you a little bit about how we work. I'm NayanTara, I'm from Kathmandu. And we set up a photo circle initially as a loose network, a community of image makers in 2007, which then led to, over a few years, the setup of Nepal Picture Library, which is a digital archive that we run, and I'll speak a little bit more about it. And then we also run this thing called Photo Kathmandu, which happens every 2 years, which is essentially a festival, an assembly, a gathering of practitioners, primarily working with lens-based practices, but also other things. So, we do a lot of teaching, learning work. So running workshops, mentorship programs, fellowships, that sort of thing. We've never set up formally as a school, but we very much work sort of like one. The archive that I mentioned, I'm just sharing one image from a project we initiated in 2018 called the Feminist Memory Project. And some of you might have seen some of this work. We've shown it a few times actually in India. The last time at Kochi, actually, where we got to show the full exhibition of all 5 chapters, which was nice. But essentially, it's a growing archive. And I very much agree with Puja earlier. She was saying, archives don't just exist, they are created. I think this is an initiative that we are very keen to continue because, I just came back actually from a traveling, we try to take the work out from a traveling exhibition experience, and everywhere we went, people were saying, well, where are we in this archive of yours? So, it's very much a growing, breathing archive. We do research ourselves, but we also invite researchers to come work with us. Divas Rajakisi, who you'll see in the bottom right in the blue shirt, he is our head of research and archives. And we work with a lot of young researchers, journalists, people who are just interested to engage with these histories and to engage with these collections. We try to publish, even though we don't identify primarily as a publisher, but we try to make books because, books have a special way to get around and get into people's private as well as institutional spaces that exhibitions cannot. We work with a lot of friends who are educators. So this is Sharare Bajracharya here. And, the dream is when we can get some of this archival work into curricular and sort of classroom spaces. And so when we're able to do that, we're really, really excited. And yes, we make exhibitions and we try to take them around. And this was just us last week. We took the show to Surkhet and to Nepalganj, which are these 2 cities in western Nepal. And, resources are not always easy to get out there, but it's always very, very important to us and also rewarding. We work as collaboratively as we can. So the Surkhet edition of the traveling exhibition was in collaboration with Karnali Arts Center, which is this small organization that has actually existed for as long as we have. So essentially for 18 years, but out in Western Nepal, and doing theater out in Western Nepal with very little resources and infrastructure. They've been doing amazing work. And this was a performance, a special one, of the Hurke dance, which is traditionally only performed by men. But this was a group of women performing this particular dance in protest. And very important to say that this is an entirely Dalit-led organization. And yeah, we're hoping to continue working together. We also run this festival, as I mentioned. So this is Bunu Dungana's work at Photo Kathmandu in 2018. This is a work called North Fake, which we showed in, I think, the 2015 edition. This was last year, the last edition. And so that's just a bit of background. Today I thought I would share with you a particular experience we had last year showing Amar Kanwar's The Sovereign Forest. And also as a way to say that, this festival that we run, that I mentioned, it's been very exciting. There are many sort of organic and then also sometimes difficult sort of ways of growing also. And so a little bit, starting to get a little bit unwieldy also, as things grow and we're a small team. And so we really we spent the last edition of the festival really wanting to sort of think of the non-human world, and the relationships that we have with it. And we wanted to invite Amar to show as part of that festival. But we had worked with him once before, and we felt that if we showed this exhibition as part of the festival, we really wouldn't be able to give it the time and the energy that it takes to have a super deep engagement with the work, which we knew we really wanted to do. And so we actually waited. So we invited Amar to the festival, of course, and he's built a course around the work called Learning from Doubt, which some of you, this work, many of you might already be very familiar with, the Sovereign Forest, because of course you all know Amar. But this course was developed during the pandemic, and he'd run it online as I believe the initial thing was like a 12-week course, but we did a smaller adaptation and we ran it for 5 weeks. A lot of it was done virtually, but the intent was to try to have a really deep engagement with the work, to try to understand the work before we actually showed it in Kathmandu. And then, of course, we showed it in Kathmandu. I would have to spend like a whole day talking to you about the work. So since we don't have the luxury of that time, I'll just go a little bit into the work. It's a very full and complex body of work. The exhibition itself and the work also, Amar has built and made in collaboration with Sharna Dastur and with Sudhir Patnaik, who is part of Samadrushti, based in Odisha. Samadrushti is a collective of young journalists and activists and local researchers in Odisha. And the work really is, telling us the story, the history of sort of the corporate takeover of lands and rivers and forests in the state of Odisha. Primarily by the mining industry, but also by many other forces, of course, always in collusion with government and so on. And so this film, the exhibition has two films, actually 2 big films and 3 smaller films. And this particular film takes us sort of to the land, sort of invites us to visit, because it's so large, and in the space it's so consuming in many ways, that it invites us to actually visit this place. The film is called The Scene of Crime, and it's framed in a way that there is a crime that has taken place here, and this is the scene of this crime. There is a particularly rich room that we built upstairs, and we've called it the evidence room. I think that's what Amar calls it too. But this is an archive that was built with Samadrushti, with Sudhirji sort of at the helm, but many, many researchers and local journalists who were part of it. And these documents that were collected over time, over many, many years, essentially documents the fights that local communities have been fighting against these extremely large forces, these corporations, and also against the government of Odisha. And some of them tell us stories about how the fight was lost, and how corporations ended up taking over. But some of them tell us stories about how actually many fights, seemingly like these David and Goliath type fights, were won, where people were able to organize and resist and use the not necessarily always fully useful or effective frameworks within legal systems, but use the legal system to also be able to fight and save lands and forests, etc. There's also a seed room which is a whole other kind of archive that is part of the work. And this became a particularly favorite spot of mine because, a man who used to be a high school teacher turned farmer named Natwar Lal Sarangi in Odisha decided to collect some 230 something varieties of indigenous rice seeds. And so this is the archive that is presented here, and we try to engage with it. So we, are operating in a context where there's very little infrastructure for the arts and culture and for any of this kind of work. So this is the top floor of the Nepal Art Council. We often work here. We rent this space and have to transform it to whatever experience that we're trying to create. This was us boarding up all the windows because this needed to be a dark space. But in all of this, I think each time we work, it's also building capacity locally. It's trying to find resources locally and learning ourselves. This, for example, on the left is Sagar Chhetri, who's a photographer himself and also leads all of our education work at Photo Circle. So, it's a very small team and very hands-on. I must mention that Amar, Sharna, Sudhirji put in a lot of time, months ahead of the show, because we translated the entire thing into Nepali. And each time we do this, we're also creating resources that we can use much later, beyond the show. This particular time, we were able to show the Sovereign Forest for a period of 4 months in Kathmandu. And had we had the venue been available, there are actually lots of dark images in this slideshow. So I wonder if somebody could hit the lights just for a moment, even though we're almost halfway in. Yeah. So this is Amar and Sharna. Briefing, before we opened, we were trying to train a bit of an army because for us, what's really special is to really activate these shows and to be able to have, a range of programming each time we work this way. And so these were young people who were, some of them were students of psychology, some of them were law students, some of them were writers and researchers. And so really, this was the team that was really leading guided tours, engaging with visitors, bringing students into the space. We were trying to particularly work with a few specific faculties such as, law students, journalism students, social work students, etc. And one activity that really stays with me is coming into the seed room and asking students, how many varieties of rice do we know about? And then literally being able to count in one hand, maybe, names, and then being able to actually think about this big question of loss of land or loss in general. If an archive is supposed to be preserving things that we are losing, this experience would be so visceral for a young person to go in there, to be like, so with land, we are also losing this diverse biodiversity. And not only are we losing these varieties of indigenous seeds to begin with, we're also losing the knowledge system that comes with knowing how to grow a particular kind of seed in a particularly big monsoon-heavy year or a dry year or so on and so forth, right? And to think about monoculture then and what that actually means and so on. And so, yes, this was an incredible archive of knowledge that young people were really, really engaging with in a very special way. So as we work, we've been trying to sort of build relationships with a few specific communities, and across and over projects, we try to sort of take the opportunity to invite the same communities back into the work. And these were a group of women from a village called Khokana, which is just 5 kilometers south of Kathmandu. And, Khokana is a place that is highly contested at the moment because there's this massive highway that is being built straight into Kathmandu, which is essentially destroying all agricultural land there, and also destroying ways of life, right? Khokana was very well known for growing mustard, and so and making this very particular kind of mustard oil. And so that's what is at loss. And so again, really thinking about what is it that we are losing and what are we trying to preserve and how, and what kinds of engagements do we have with memory and loss, and what are we doing about it also, to resist, to record, and then to actually think of it very much in the contemporary present day context also. That an archive of things is not necessarily something of the past only, but very much something that informs and educates and challenges us also at the present day. So Amar has talked about the sovereign forest as something that has had these overlapping identities. He says it continuously reincarnates as an art installation, an exhibition, a library, a memorial, a public trial, an open call for da-da-da. This really resonates with us because, sorry, the rest of the text is up there. Because, I feel like increasingly our work is also getting very interdisciplinary. And the exhibition, the 4 months that we had it for in Kathmandu, that's what it was becoming. It was becoming a space for learning, teaching and learning, so a school. It was becoming an archive. Of course, it is an archive in various ways. So we ran 2 symposiums that I just want to quickly share a little bit about. The first one was this exercise to try to reimagine what museums are supposed to mean to us. Nepal, as you might know, myself, I think I'm representing a generation that is very much negotiating this deep sea change where we've transitioned from a 240-year-old monarchy to this democratic republic. And in this process, there are many histories that we are countering and renegotiating, and everybody wants to be counted. And so there have been many museums that have been just sprung up all around the country because everybody feels like our history matters and we're going to build a museum. But very much also then the trope of the ethnographic museum and the struggles with all of that. So this is Ganga Limbo. I wish I could spend more time talking to you about each of these projects because they were all very, very special projects. But these are projects, these are people and groups of people who are attempting to archive and document indigenous knowledge, for example. This is Niranjan Chaudharyji, who's trying to build this memorial park in Western Nepal that essentially tries to memorialize the 13-year Maoist insurgency we all lived through. He himself lost both his father and brother in those 13 years, one to the hands of the Maoist army and the other to the Nepali army. And so there are these very big histories that we are still trying to contend with and document. We tried to draw inspiration from friends. This is Molemo from South Africa, and she shared with us their work that they've been doing around restitution and what that has meant to their context. We watched an Azule film because she's so impossible to read. Sorry, I'll speak for myself. So the film was very, very lovely. But, it gave this very big picture, sort of deep history take on, links between sort of the colonial ravages and then the capitalist ravages and then present day quote-unquote development work that's been happening. Through all of this programming, some of it we went outdoors, we spoke to people. This is in Khokana, that area I spoke to you about, super, super fast urbanizing area, outskirts of Kathmandu. where there's, many things that we are losing, right? So we also ran this collectors convention, we called it. This was Amar's bright and brilliant idea, but really to ask this question about why do we collect what we collect? Like, what significance and meaning do these things, objects, many things, have to us, and how does it sort of speak to our fears of loss and erasure, right? So there were so many lovely people who came collecting matchboxes, collecting coins, collecting this young woman in the bottom right, she was collecting these catalogs to all the theater productions that so there's a whole theater archive sitting right there in her collection that nobody's really explored. Indira ji has been collecting dolls for 40 years, but each of these dolls have stories and etc. So this was a fun thing to do. I'm just going to wrap up. Then we ran another symposium that was also really a lot of learning for us, where I think one of the things that the Sovereign Forest offered us was this documentation of resistance, because often, the other side feels so overpowering that, we don't see the small on-the-ground resistance that is taking place and also is working in many ways. So we convened this gathering of about, I think it was like 90-something people. These were all people from across Nepal who are fighting large development projects, corporate projects. And Sudhirji came from Odisha, and we were able to spend 4 days together to really sort of share tactics, share experiences, share wins, share losses also. And then this work has continued. And then finally, just to share, we decided to use the exhibition, the Sovereign Forest, as a prompt for a fellowship program that we initiated. So then 8 young fellows came on board, and over the course of a year created contemporary work that was beginning to document, these takeovers of lands, forests, waters that are happening now in Nepal, which culminated in that same space, so that shell that the Sovereign Forest left behind. Then we sort of occupied it with local narratives from Nepal that these young Nepali practitioners were building. So this was Samagra's work documenting the building of large hydro projects. This has become the big cash cow in Nepal at the moment, and particularly looking at the impact, so this would be dammed here. The Maji community in particular, who live and work on the river, and how their ways of life would be impacted. So in real time, in real life, like, this is the loss that we are being faced with, and how are we contending with some of this. So I'll stop here because I've gone over 20, but hopefully we can keep talking. Thank you.
Thanks, NayanTara. We'll move to Duygu's presentation.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Suvani I kind of proposed 3 different things that I could talk about, and Suvani said if you could talk about all of them, that would be great. So I don't know how much of that I can manage, but I have about 52 slides to go through. So I won't be explaining everything that I show you, but hopefully that kind of creates conversation that we can have later. And I'm not going to be doing justice to the artist. It's more about my own story of working with archives and how that informs my curatorial as well as my academic. But I also want to tell you this, this presentation is intentionally very personal, where I've intertwined really what I do academically and curatorially with my personal story, because 2 things. One, I think it's more relatable that way, and 2, because I now look back at what I do from the lens of some 2 things that Paul Ricoeur has pointed out in his book called Memory, History, and Forgetting. one thing, and I'm going to quote this, he asks, is not memory fundamentally reflexive as the pronominal form which predominates in French will have us believe? To remember is se souvenir. To remember something is at the same time to remember oneself. So I realized much later that a lot of my projects actually have to do with my own interests and my own biography and my own political motivations. So that's one part that's really important to me, and that's why maybe it will feel too personal to you. And then the second thing he says that I really identify with is he says, and Katya is here, who's a Greek speaker, so I'm going to really butcher these two words. I should have asked you how to pronounce. But to remember in Greek, there are two words, mneme and anamnesis. Okay, thank you. While mneme is to have a memory, something that just pops up in your mind, or it's a smell or a sound. So it's something that you don't have to do anything for. It just comes up. But anamnesis is to set off in search of a memory. And I think some of the archival work that I do is to set off in search of a memory, or there are artists who set off in search of a memory that gets me really excited, and I want to work on their projects with them. Okay, so that's the theoretical part, I think. So the last thing there is memory is active rather than passive, both individually and collectively, and what we choose to remember from what we forgot has a profound effect on how we construct and understand history and ultimately ourselves. So I'll just start with an example of why that's really important to me. This was a work that I was invited to write about. I wasn't involved in curating it. It's a work by Hale Tengar called I Know People Like This 3. And it was an archive. It's a huge negatoscope. So it starts on the facade of the building. So it's kind of like Arta used to have this shop window. And then once you walk inside, it's this labyrinthine work, which functions like a giant negatoscope, what you use to look at X-rays. So it's this luminous corridor. And what's happening in this corridor is Hale looked at photographic archives from different foundations, newspapers, and individual journalists of events in Turkey's history. And she started kind of going back in time. So the shop window starts with the most recent events. So there were some protests in the southeastern region, Kurdish protests in Diyarbakir before the exhibition opened. So the last few images are from that protest that she integrated, which was on the shop window. And it goes back in time. And it's basically moments of state violence on its own citizens that she selected from these archives. So it's very much like what Puja said, and also NayanTara, that we create archives. We have to create archives. We can't just say the archive exists. Some of it you have to politically be motivated to make into an archive. So this was an archive of political strife, attacks. This is a very recognizable in Turkey of a mother basically holding the picture of a missing son, because these are disappeared people and mostly by the state, and you don't know what's happened to them. And we have something called the Saturday Mothers, which they protest every Saturday. They used to protest every Saturday, holding these pictures of their missed children. So these are quite recognizable images, but they're kind of decontextualized in this labyrinthine display. And for me, this was really important because it took me back to a childhood memory. This is on the left is Uğur Mumcu, which is a Turkish journalist. He was an investigative journalist looking into the deep state and its relation to certain acts of terror and corruption. And he was killed in a car bomb in the early 90s, 93, which is when I was 8. And it happened one street above where I lived. So it was the first time I actually came across terror and state terror. And I didn't know what it was, and I attended the vigil with my family, and we took a candle there. And I think it's really hard for parents to explain to a child what just happened. What was the blast that you heard, or why are all of these people gathering in front of this journalist's house? So to me, this was a moment where the personal and the political and the artistic really come together. And I brought this image because this is Galeri Nev, which also represents the artist Halit Tenger now. But this is the gallery, and it's from an opening because I lived right next to this. So our apartment building was next to a gallery. So two childhood memories that are in physical proximity, but there's this huge intellectual as well as emotional disparity between these two experiences, right? One is my mom taking me to a gallery and me learning how to look at art. And the other is a bomb explodes just one street over. And how do you bring these two completely distinct experiences together? And I think some artists do that. And that's what really motivates me in my curatorial work. But how did I become so this is part one. Part two, how did I become a curator? I started working at SALT, which is this institution in Istanbul, a year before it opened in 2010. It opened in 2011 with this exhibition called Hüseyin Bahri Abtekin, I'm Not a Studio Artist. So I was hired as an editor, not as a curator. And Hüseyin had just passed away about a year before this project started. And he was a good friend of my boss. And my boss was supposed to curate the exhibition, and I was supposed to edit the book, which was his first monograph. And he had never had a solo exhibition. So it became one of the central missions of SALT, which was to give a Turkish artist about every 2 years a retrospective if they have never had a retrospective. And if they've never had a monograph, we could also publish a book. But SALT does electronic books mostly. Only in certain cases it will do printed books. So I did the book, and Hüseyin was a collector and a traveler, and worked as a photographer for SIPA Press before he became an artist. And he was really interested in this underbelly of globalism, hotel signs, migration, people as well as objects moving. And he was very itinerant himself. But my boss, Vasif Kortan, he couldn't bring himself to work on the exhibition, and I was doing research for the book and finding out a lot. So it's a person who had passed away. I had never met him, so my only access to him is through this hard drive that we have in the office. And the other thing that we did with my colleague, who's the head of research at SALT right now, SALT Research, Sezin Rami. Some of you know her because of AAA. She and I basically embarked on an oral history project because we wanted to understand the person and the output. So we talked to a lot of people and recorded the conversations, but never showed the conversations so that they could be frank and sincere in what they shared with us. And in that process, I started finding works that were lost, that were kept in friends' storage houses, off somewhere in Europe in a small institution that was still keeping the work because they couldn't ship it back to him due to lack of funds. So I ended up slowly curating the exhibition and finding works, suggesting them, working on a layout. And then Vasif commissioned 5 new works to 5 artists who made works in homage to Hüseyin. And then I ended up basically doing the show and the book. So that's how I entered curating, through the archive of someone who had passed away. So it was also this absence of a person that I was trying to understand. And I was criticized for making it too clean. Hüseyin was a messy person, entertaining artist, and what I had done was a little bit to historicize and clean his practice. And I took that criticism to heart. So then this is his archive, which is now accessible on the SALT website. And his library, which is an exception, his personal library of books is part of the SALT library. And that's not true for all the artists, that's impossible to do. But just in case of Hüseyin, because he was a special case, we also host his archive. The other project, which is archival and formative for me, is this is the gate of a formerly squatted house in London near the Whitechapel, and it belongs to this man called Ismail Sarai, who I didn't know anything about. I was in London at Tate Modern co-curating a very small show, and Vasif said, hey, we've been trying to reach this artist, Ismail Sarai. He never responds to our email. Maybe when you go to London, you can try to reach him. And I invited him to the opening of the show with an email invite. And then I forgot about it. And then he came to the opening and found my mother, because my mom was speaking in Turkish to somebody, and said, this gentleman would like to meet you. And then we started working on his archive. So I found out he was an artist who had been educated in Britain in the late 60s, so very much a flower child, and returned back to Turkey and to repay his debt to the state, because if you're sent abroad to study, when you come back, you have to teach 1.5 times as many years as you got the fellowship for. So if you had like a 5-year study, 7.5 years of state service. 5 minutes, okay. And then, so basically he had been doing his state service, and because he was a bit of a hippie, and he came back to Turkey with a British wife and had this really weird conceptual practice that nobody really understood at the time. He had been sent off to a high school in the Black Sea region and was doing experimental performance work with his students there. But then the left-right struggles became really serious, and was also spread into universities and campuses and across the country. And he was targeted for looking the way he looked, and also being very leftist, and he felt quite unsafe, and actually escaped Turkey before the 1980s coup, just by a few months. This is us basically just processing his archive and airing it, because it was in the humidity of London for so long. It was a really smelly archive too. And we digitized a lot of these sound pieces he had made as a student, and some of his films. And we talked to these artist friends who had also, like this is Osman Dinç in Paris, we're interviewing him. This was a work that the late Cengiz Çekil kept. So he went to London, and he kept participating in exhibitions by sending instructions. So on the left, you see an instruction of a work, and then his colleagues. And it's truly conceptual in both its thinking and its making. So he would send the instructions, and he can no longer enter Turkey. He didn't repay his debt student debt completely, so he's basically escaped. So he's sending these instructions, and his friends are making the work for him and showing it. So this is how he participated in a lot of exhibitions in the 80s in Istanbul and in Izmir. So we found some of these works because the friends had kept them. And when we did this exhibition at SALT, we showed a lot of his student work, which he had kept. And this space where we had laid the archive at first became the site for recreating this sisal installation he had done in the gym of his school. So this is him as a 70-plus-year-old coming back to recreate this student work. And in his own Royal College of Art show, MFA show, he had showed some of this work with these like tilted photographs, as well as the artist books he made. So we used the same strategy in showing some of the documentation of the work. And then we asked him to make some of these drawings again. When you work with a conceptual artist, it's really nice because you can get them to remake the work. So this is his student studio at the Royal College of Art. And then this is him remaking that same drawing for SALT. And then he was really interested in artist books. I think he's the first person to make an artist book in Turkey in 1978. And he participated in this exhibition with the Art Definition Society, and they only showed artist books. So the exhibition was sitting at tables and looking at books, which was at the time a really radical proposal. And we so this is SALT, this is the 1980 show. So we recreated the same setup and put facsimiles of the artist books that you could basically browse. And 3 years after the show, we made his book. So by this time, I had left SALT and I had started my PhD. It was nice to make the book later because actually a lot of people came to the show and they had stories to tell, like, oh, I went to that high school and he was actually my teacher. These kinds of stories. So then we were able to integrate some of that into the book that we made. And I wrote this article which was published in Art Margins. And it's interesting to see the history of a time in Turkey through a figure and the traces those political movements left on this artist and how that actually shaped his practice. And I think that's sometimes the only way through which I can tolerate certain political truths. I think that's also why I'm always trying to bring the two together. And then through that at SALT, basically, we have this archival network. And after Ismail Saray, because we ended up talking to so many artists for his exhibition, then we got those artists' archives as well. So they were processed over the years. And so it became this network of artistic archives, and it tells different stories. And then I'll skip a few things. And then I'll just go to my dissertation because it's a funny story. Just last thing, which is again about the making of archives. Sorry, I don't know which way the slides are going. Okay, so I was working on late Ottoman and early modern Turkish art, and there's only one place where you could see the images, the paintings, and get any archival material, which is the Istanbul Paintings and Sculpture Museum, which is a state museum, and state museums are notoriously bad and inaccessible. And I would call them and they wouldn't respond. I could only get to a security guard, not past him. And the museum was closed at the time because it was under renovation. And then this weird thing happened and they asked my former director to become its director. And then he asked me if I could become its curator. So I only got access to this archive by becoming the curator of the institution, which didn't last very long. 8 months in total, because it's just impossible to work with a state structure, and they didn't want to do anything at our own standards, and we really tried. Like, we did try. It wasn't just to access the archive for me. I was emotionally invested, but it didn't happen. But whenever we went to the archive, because we're not state employees, they would send a security guard with us and who would watch over us as we worked in the archive. And then we asked if it could be digitized, because we wanted posterity and accessibility for other people. And it got digitized, but then the president of the school kept the hard drive under lock and key in her own room. And we could only access it when she gave us access. This is one of the reasons we couldn't open this exhibition. But one of the things I found there was an inventory notebook, which was not in the archive, but in the office. And this was the notebook created by Osman Hamdi Bey's brother, who was the first manager of the museum. And then I found out that the museum collection is actually based on copies. They had commissioned copies of European works to be made to have a European museum, because they couldn't afford the originals. And at the time, copy and original wasn't as distinguished and different in value as we think now. So then I wrote a whole chapter on why the Turkish modern painting tradition is based on the notion of the copy. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Duygu. Clearly, the maximalist impulses to explore this place where the curatorial meets the archival is not conducive to timekeeping. So I will, for now, I have a bunch of questions, but I think we should open it up to the audiences, because I'm sure there's points and thoughts and ideas floating in here after the very rich presentation. So in case there are questions from the audience, we can take that in first. And if not, then I will chime in. Yeah.
Thank you so much for amazing presentations. I wanted to just drive back to the logic of the archive, right? Very often in the archive, what's most fascinating is what's not in the archive. So how do you deal with archival loss? And in literary tradition, someone like Saidiya Hartman has been confronting this with the transatlantic slave trade, right? What do you do with those who do not maintain an archive? What do you do with the tales of slaves who were transported across the Atlantic but have left, no trace? And the second thing I want to ask, particularly with your work in Nepal, is contemporary archives can often be equally ephemeral, right? That with movement building, so much of the work that's done is done digitally. And these archives disappear. What happens when tweets disappear and states take them down? Or posters that are memes, like we saw here in India during our CA and RC protests, disappear? How do you catalog the volume of those archives? And then how do you showcase that as a curatorial project?
The first one, who wants to respond to?
The absence of archive. I think you still write a history around it and you point to the absence. I can think of one example, which is in my dissertation, it's all men, and there's a portrait of, it's called Painter Friends, and it's all men like posing together. And I realized that there were also women painters. There was a women fine arts academy. Its director was a really famous painter, and they were actually all friends. But this portrait didn't include any of the women. It was all men. And you just talk about the absence together with the document or painting or the archive. You point to why it's actually there's a lot to write about, because then you can write about all the motivations for why that's absent or the physical conditions for why that was absent. So the absence of an archival document doesn't mean the absence of the story, I think.
Would you like to?
Yep, I can respond. I suppose to club those two things together, I think what we've been doing is essentially responding to gaps or absence. Well, not just some things there are gaps, and then sometimes there are no archives at all also, right? So, but I think our response has been to then generate archives. So I think all of the work that we're doing with Nepal Picture Library, but also earlier what I was sharing, like sort of using something like the Sovereign Forest as a prompt to then initiate a series of projects that are actually documenting what's happening now. And you're very right. I mean, the last slide in my presentation, which I should have gotten to, were just screenshots I made yesterday as I was coming in the taxi from the airport. Because I ended on the slide of the work of a young artist named Sara Tunic-Coinch, who is currently sort of making work, but trying to document and very much, she's very much a part of, I think, responding to something that's happening in eastern Nepal right now, where this, same old story, rich man has come along and wanting to build a cable car project, for which they have decimated this massive forest, which is of great spiritual significance to the Limbu people in eastern Nepal. So there have been a lot of protests happening, etc. And yesterday I saw a story on Instagram, which lives for 24 hours only, right? But basically it was a video of these 12 people who had been arrested 25 days ago and had been kept in prison for 25 days for protesting. And they had been released, so there was some like Phul Mala thing happening, and this guy. And the Instagram handle that had posted it is an artist collective, primarily Limbu, but also other Janajati artists, the name of which is escaping me right now, but I will share. But, they were there present and they're documenting as they go. Now, there has been an effort, in fact, a friend who's a researcher and a scholar was just in touch recently to say, hey, can you guys help us begin to archive all of this, because everything's happening so fast. And so there have been some of these efforts, but yes, the challenges are real, you know. I mean, with the digital era, it's easier, but also much more at risk. So, yeah.
I was just wondering about the initiatives that have been set up to disseminate and disperse the information that is collected through these archives. And I think that would be a far more productive exercise than to be too self-conscious about whether we're doing the right thing or not. What have we not done? What are we doing? And the fact that this information needs to be available to legal frameworks and that are sort of set up within these communities, so that they are enabled to kind of push back. And I was just wondering, what are the initiatives? What have in your experience, all of you, has it? What are these kinds of initiatives? What are the initiatives that have been made possible through the archive, and also archives, museums that exist in cities? We need them as well because they represent a sort of a stable situation, which has the privilege of being able to gather the information and to preserve it, at least for a short period of time, But then what about these floating communities? And it's something that these floating communities and communities that are on the verge of extinction can access, So I think it's a constant, as with the setting up of the archive, the dispersal and the dissemination of the information is something that I'm interested in.
I think accessibility of archives is something that is quite a challenge. Like, even I can speak from my experience, like even within institutions, I was just talking to Duygu before the panel. Even like within institutions, the sharing of archives and everything is very, very difficult. Like, to be able to do that. And I think in the museum, what we try and do is more to do a public access through the exhibitions, through the programs. That's what we can sort of do. But accessibility, of course, it is a challenge, for sure.
For instance,
yeah.
If the maps would be shared.
Yeah.
Because the maps are a very important
Right.
element in kind of contesting.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, through publications and things, and that there's, yeah, exactly, yeah. So then it becomes like a compilation after, I guess, when you make a publication and reproduce it, that can then be shared with the communities and, yeah. Take it.
Maybe in NayanTara, I think in the
Maybe,
way
yeah.
the exercises are conducted. Would you
Yeah.
have
Exercises?
like
Meaning
the
the
kind
books,
of
yeah.
pedagogical sort of. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm big on, so at Nepal Picture Library, where we work, Divas leads the research, and I'm super passionate about the dissemination part of it. So, I'm constantly, we're super committed to trying to get it out as much as possible ourselves, given our limitations, etc. So we make books, and in fact, I'm staying a few extra days here in Delhi because we're reprinting this book we made called The Public Life of Women, which features a few chapters from the Feminist Memory Project, etc. But all that, it is still limiting, no? So I think we do what we can, but of course, so much more needs to happen. We've also really been trying to think hard about what is supposed to happen to this archive in 10, 20, whatever years, after we're gone also. Where is it supposed to live? What are the institutional infrastructures that are available to us? Do we want to give it away to some foreign university who might house it? Do we not want to do that? But then what are also the political risks within Nepal that might sort of be critical things to think about? So we try as much as we can. We are building, as I was saying to Katja, it's been 3 years and we're still building it, a website to try to put the entire archive online. That's the goal, the dream, but of course then there are many factors to consider there. Also, some collections and archives don't want to be fully accessible necessarily for various security and other reasons, you know. So yeah, we try. I think what we've also been thinking is really to work with a university. So we're trying to have these conversations in Nepal, to try to sort of have the archive live there in the long run. But yeah, I mean, that has its challenges also. So I don't know if there is, you know, the perfect way, but we do what we can for the moment. Yeah.
I'll just respond really quickly. I think there are two ways, which is of dissemination. One is, like you were saying, like make everything online, make it accessible. That's it sounds lovely, but it's also a data dump, right? Like my curatorial practice students last semester, I assigned them to work with archives that are online, and it's really daunting to work with an archive or to be presented with all this material and not know where to start or what stories are in there if you don't have a clue. So I think you have to have that available for sure, but you have to also do a lot of activations, storytelling through articles or books or exhibition. I think the exhibitionary format is good for that because it makes things visible and easier to access and understand, but that also becomes one story among many. Then you have to point that this comes from this source, and if you go to this source, you could perhaps find another story to tell. So I think it has to be an act of balancing.
Hello. Yeah, thank you for the talk. There are a lot of things to discuss. I'm just interested, and this question is for Puja. You mentioned a few times abstraction. I'm curious about this idea of abstraction in archive. One point I want to start with this, that I don't believe Nasrin is abstractionist, and there is a lot of discussion happening, and I think if I can quote Puja, Gita Kapoor, she also mentioned that there was a time when they were lacking words, so that's why they framed Nasrin in abstraction as abstractionist. But I think that's now, that frame is broken. But however, I'm just curious because somewhere I feel the way we are treating archive and we're talking and we're practicing archives, it actually goes against the idea of abstraction. I'm not talking abstraction in the context of its ontology or something, but as an affect. The way meaning-making exercises associated with archives, the way now archives are very close to economy and cultural economy and both capital and all. So how do we actually, is it possible to respond to that idea of abstraction through archive or through archival process? Because somewhere also I feel that archives, like, I can give some example like Vivan Sundaram's or Arkadi's archives and all, which are famous and have bigger values because they are somehow connected with the national narratives. They are part of nation buildings and all. So archives which doesn't come to that idea or doesn't subscribe to the ideological premise, then it has no value. So where does that abstraction lie, or is there at all abstraction? We can talk about it, or there is no just a part of speech?
Thank you. Thanks for that question. No, I think it's a very thought-provoking question because a lot of times I think there are certain terms that are already there in the mainstream, and like you rightly said, there are alternate ways to look at it. They come from their own sort of perspectives. Like a lot of most art history has been, it has had a very strong bias, you know, especially when you talk about modernism. Even that whole term, what is modern, what is contemporary, I think all of that can be challenged in many different ways. Of course, having said that, I think if you speak about that time, then these were the sort of, you know, tendencies and aesthetics of art. And yeah, sometimes one of the things that in writing and art history does is categorize things very stringently, and that is definitely something that we have to be careful of. And I think that's one thing that was in the show. If you're talking about Nasreen and that her aesthetic, it was a sort of pared down aesthetic. It had and actually this is one of the things that I find quite interesting, because most artists who are considered abstractionists or they themselves will never ever call themselves or they always say that it's rooted in so many different things. So I think it's a good question, because there are many terms that also come down to us and that have to be constantly looked at from an alternate sort of from our view, also in terming history, in terming periods, in terming everything. It's one-sided. It's one point of view. And when you look here, it becomes, we are a country which had many different places, artists coming from different backgrounds, different regions, also grappling with so many different realities. When you think of from the colonial times to being a new nation to what that meant. So I think art always has those kind of, those kind of ideas that are reflected in it. And also I think every time you relook at these things, it kind of changes. You can reframe them differently. What we are saying now, maybe in another 5-10 years, we could reframe it differently. So yeah, definitely.
Thanks for the question, and thanks, Puja. And unfortunately, I'm getting looks from that corner of the room, so we'll have to take the questions outside. But thank you all. And I also just wanted to leave with 2 quick points that actually bring in the question of absences. And just because I didn't get to respond, something very quickly that I want to say is that I think we are also looking at absences that are visible, but one of the questions that comes to mind is how does one sense the absences that are not visible in the archive, and how in some ways I think all of your work is also in a very relational sort of, like, it looks at the relational orbits that the archives rest within, and how the relational can maybe make us think of absences that are actually also in the unknown as well as in the known. And along with this and some of the other questions in the room, I think we can move into tea.
Yeah.
And I tried my best.
We're just running on a very tight schedule, so we'll break for tea now. This is going to be till 12:15. At 12:15 sharp, we're going to reconvene. We have our second panel, which is Politics and Art, Curating Difficult Knowledges. Moderator Shukla Sawant, panelists Avni Sethi, Gayatri Sinha, and Shudha. So yeah, use the time and also catch up with the curators.